A narrower deck feels easier to flip. A wider deck feels more stable, but are those really true? And if they are, how much of a difference do they really make? First, let's set the conditions. We'll use these three decks: 7.75, 8.0, 8.25. Each deck will use tracks that match its width. Everything else, including the wheels and bearings, will be exactly the same. Let's start by looking at how we affect flip tracks. First, physically, wider objects tend to be harder to rotate because of the weight distribution. Imagine there are two boards with the same weight. One has most of its weight concentrated in the center, while the other has most of its weight distributed near the edges. If you apply the same force, the latter one will spin more slowly. Have you ever held a dumbbell? A dumbbell isn't just heavy, it's also very difficult to spin. That's because the farther an object's mass is distributed from its center, the harder it is to rotate. The same principle applies to skateboards. As the deck gets wider, it doesn't just become heavier. More of its mass is also distributed farther away from the center. As a result, a wider deck becomes harder to rotate. But what's interesting is that being wider gives you more leverage. Think about a door. It's much easier to open it by pushing near the doorknob than by pushing right next to the hinges. That's because applying force farther away from the axis of rotation creates more turning effect. The same is true for a skateboard. The wider a deck is, the farther its edges from the center of rotation become. Compared with a narrower deck, this gives you more leverage, making the board easier to rotate. So a wider deck is both harder and easier to rotate. What would happen when we combine them? If the force required to rotate an 8-inch deck by 360 degrees is applied to the other decks, a 7.75-inch deck would rotate about 389 degrees, or about 8% more. An 8.25-inch deck, on the other hand, would rotate about 334 degrees, or about 9% less. Now that we have the figures, what do they tell us? For example, if you're doing a kickflip and catching the board when it becomes flat, then an 8 to 9% difference in rotation is probably small enough to ignore. You might feel some difference though. However, if you're catching the board just before pre-mode, that difference could become significant. Compared with an 8-inch deck, an 8.25-inch deck rotates about 26 degrees less. That difference could be enough to make you land on your board upside down. Of course, it doesn't mean a wider deck is always unsuitable for flip tricks. If you know you're riding a wider deck, you'll naturally flick harder. These results only describe what happens when the same amount of force is applied to different sized boards. Next, let's look at turning performance. When you turn on a skateboard, you lean the deck in the direction you want to go. Because of the leverage effect we discussed earlier, by applying the same force to the edge of these decks, they lean by roughly 3% different amounts. If you keep on riding, the size of your turning arc could surely change. However, since the difference is only about 3%, it's probably small enough to ignore. So overall, the effect of deck width on turning performance is quite limited. Finally, let's talk about stability. People often say that wider decks are more stable, but is it really true? The word stable can mean different things, so in this video, we'll define stability as having less toe-to-heel tilt, which is something many beginners struggle with. In fact, a wider deck allows your feet to contact the board farther from its center, while it does give you a wider space to stand on. As I explained earlier, that actually makes the board easier to tilt. When the deck tilts too much, it can touch the wheels, causing the wheel bite, which acts like a sudden brake. To prevent it, wider decks are often paired with harder bushings or riser pads. These components help prevent wheel bite even if you put your weight on one side more. They also allow the board to respond more flexibly to your balance. As a result, the setup may feel more stable. In other words, it's not the wider deck itself that increases stability. Of course, different physics come into play when you're riding at high speed or skating large sections, but let's talk about it some other time. And that's all for this episode. Thank you so much for watching. Until next time.